Hi everyone, today I'm going to use a 2017 book called Walking Through Social Research to talk about walking sociology. I've been interested in walking and walking to observe for a very long time. I've lived all of my life in Adelaide. I've lived right in the heart of the city. I've lived in an assortment of inner city suburbs, and I now live in an outer suburb in the north. These are all quite different walking experiences, and you get to observe different ways of living. For example, you notice that there's loads of available public transport in the city and inner city suburbs, whereas there's a far greater dependence on cars when you move out of the city. When you're walking, you can observe changes over time and connect your biography to place. Australian sociologist Rob Watts grew up in the inner city suburb of Footscray in Melbourne. He remembers that it was treeless, bleak, and in summer it smelled. The stench of vomit from the rope works, blood and cow shit from the meat works, or coal, gas or petroleum fumes was unavoidable, he writes. Rob Watts moved out of Footscray years ago and now lives in what he describes as a green and leafy suburb. He changed his circumstances from working class lad to well-paid academic, and Footscray's changed too. Some call it one of Melbourne's most livable suburbs. It's certainly a vibrant and multicultural place when I visited there. Where Footscray has lost what French sociologist Loic Wacquant calls territorial stigmatisation, where it's lost that over time, other areas don't. Mark Peel is another academic who's retired recently from the University of Leicester. He moved there a number of years ago from Australia. He grew up in Elizabeth and then became an academic in Australia, particularly at Monash University. Now he writes about growing up in Elizabeth, and he was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, around about the same time as Rob Watts. He talked about how he'd hear these negative comments when he was travelling north along Main North Road. He'd hear negative comments about Elizabeth, so he was well aware as a small child and young man about the stigma. Now, in our reading last week, Megan Ware and her colleagues talked about how residents of Elizabeth were well aware of territorial stigmatisation too, although they didn't use that term. Now, that publication was back in 2008, but I'm pretty sure that stigma hasn't shifted off or away from Elizabeth in the last 13 years or so. So where it shifted from Footscray, it hasn't shifted from Elizabeth. When you're walking in Australia, you know you're at the bottom of the street hierarchy. Cars are at the top. Cars have priority. David Levinson at the University of Sydney says that state and city governments say on the one hand they want to encourage fewer cars and more walking, but on the other hand, whereas pedestrians once upon a time crossed the road wherever and whenever they wanted to, now we spend 20% of our time waiting at lights. Levinson reckons this has to change, and therefore so too should Australian road rules, which need to be rewritten or written more clearly to prioritise walkers.
What he reckons should happen is we should adopt an attitude toward walkers as they have in the United Kingdom, where pedestrians are at the top of the street hierarchy. Then there's cyclists, then there's public transport users, then there's specialist motor vehicles like, the ambulance or whatever. And people who are just driving into the city for work or for shopping or whatever, they're at the bottom of the street hierarchy, which for me, have been walking for a long time and knowing I'm at the bottom of the street hierarchy is almost inconceivable.
When I was in the Netherlands in 2019 and staying with my oldest son and his partner, it took only about 5 minutes walking around the city of Utrecht to notice that bicycles have priority. It wasn't cars, but it certainly wasn't pedestrians either. And in Utrecht, they have these amazing stations where instead of parking your car, you can park your bike.
And one of the things that I noticed that I wouldn't have noticed if I wasn't walking is that lots of people live in, what do they call these, row houses or houses built very close together. Usually they're multi-storey. And you can see, as you're walking along, during the daytime, you can see into the windows, and because the windows are so close to the walking area, to the footpath, you're kind of really up close and personal, and it was kind of confronting in a way. I felt as if I was invading people's privacy. What my son told me is that you learn very quickly that in Utrecht you keep your curtains open during the daytime, because if you don't, you're regarded as a highly suspicious character. So it's not until it's dark that you would close people off from looking in your place. What I noticed when I was walking in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam a couple of years ago was the amazingly busy street life. And by contrast, Adelaide Street seemed to be more for getting from one place to another rather than for hanging out, except in a few spots, I guess, like the Rundle Street eating precinct.
Close to the end of his 5 years as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, Warren Bebbington unveiled his vision for the architectural transformation of the university. His two priorities, I remember him saying, was to get rid of Napier and to level the campus so that we no longer have to climb stairs to get from one end to the other. Loads of people poo-pooed him, but I didn't. I was diagnosed with osteoarthritis in my knees about 8 or 9 years ago, and was told if I wanted to avoid major surgery to replace them, I'd have to give up using stairs. Whereas when I started working here in 2011, I was dutifully climbing the stairs for exercise, as that silly sign we have at the lifts in Napier now says, to burn calories rather than energy, which was absolutely the worst thing for me to do. As I stopped climbing stairs, I noticed how the university is designed to give priority to able-bodied people. Ableism is actually mapped on the campus. And I know it's changed over the years. There's a central campus access lift, which was opened as recently as February 2006. The lift was installed to meet requirements under the Disability Discrimination Act of 1993. When it comes to thinking about walking and social research, there are two strands for thinking about that relationship. On the one hand, there's walking as a meditative practice, a way of blowing away cobwebs and arriving at insights. Since 2014, The New Yorker has been running a story regularly in this strand called Why Walking Helps Us Think. And they talk about changes to our chemistry, forming new connections between brain cells, the way our attention is free to wander because we don't have to concentrate much to walk unless you're a 1-year-old or have had a serious accident and then you're concentrating very hard. If you're interested in this strand, you might like Shane O'Mara's 2019 book In Praise of Walking. O'Mara is Professor of Experimental Brain Research at Trinity College in Dublin, and he has only good things to say about going out for a walk instead of going to the gym. Philosophers like Rousseau, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, they're all famous for their walking habits. In his 2013 book about the daily rituals of artists and thinkers, Mason Curry has about a quarter of them routinely walking for at least half an hour a day, often longer. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes took a long morning walk each morning after breakfast, and then he recorded his meditations as soon as he got back home, and these formed the basis for his day's work. Poet John Milton, who was blind for 20 years, spent more than 3 hours each day after lunch walking up and down his garden. Composer Ludwig von Beethoven always spent afternoons out walking for hours, noting down ideas that came to him along the way. Poet Wallace Stevens had a day job as an insurance lawyer. Every workday he walked up to 12 kilometres between home and work, and often also walked for an hour during his lunch break too. And it was during these long walks that he composed his poetry, scribbling on envelopes that he kept in his pockets for the purpose. I've included artist Georgia O'Keeffe because I really like her work, and she walked for 30 minutes in the morning most days of the week. Composer Gustav Mahler dragged his wife off for 3 to 4 hour walks along the beach after lunch every day. Along the way, he jotted down ideas and took breaks for composition, during which his poor old wife would be compelled to sit and wait for him, not daring to look at, let alone interrupt, the maestro at his work. The English poet William Wordsworth was a big one for walking too. He walked off his restlessness, and it was also his way of writing. For his sister Dorothy, walking had a different meaning. It was a way of being with William and supporting him in his career as a poet. As adults, William and Dorothy were very close, but as children they'd been separated. After their mother died, when Dorothy was only about 6, she was sent off to live with relatives and didn't see any of her 4 brothers for 9 years after that. In 1790, William and Dorothy went on their first extended walk together, and Dorothy Wordsworth's biographer, Frances Wilson, sees that as Dorothy, and I quote, walking out of the life that she and others expected of her, out of a hierarchy in which she, a poor relation, was at the bottom of the pile. Walking was an act of defiance, but it was also an assertion of Dorothy's sense of homelessness and the pilgrim's liminality. End of quote. American writer and academic at Hunter College, Dennis Paoli, says about Edgar Allan Poe and his poem The Raven, which is described by some as the most striking poem of the 19th century and by others as the most popular one for that time. Paoli says he thinks Poe was walking as he wrote the poem, and he writes, and I quote, "Poe probably wrote The Raven while he was working in Lower Manhattan editing a couple of magazines in long days, spending long hours writing and proofreading the work of others to put these magazines together. He hadn't been in New York very long, and he had just moved into a small house with his wife and her mother on a farm, which is now my neighbourhood. I live on 84th Street and West End Avenue, and 84th Street has been renamed Edgar Allan Poe Street because it was there during that time that he wrote The Raven. It's likely that, as poor as he was, he would be walking to work every day and walking home at night, a journey of 10 miles, which is about 16 kilometres. And if you listen to The Raven, the insistent rhythm of it, this march that its metre takes, once upon a midnight dreary, you can almost hear him walking, and it's almost as if his imagination were focused on that rhythm as he walked, and in it developing the most spectacular poem of its time." Writer Charles Dickens worked hard and methodically, but at 2 p.m. every day he would go out for a 3-hour walk along the London streets or country lanes collecting material for his stories. If you're interested in the connections between writers walking and the stories they wrote, you might be interested in Matthew Beaumont's book, The Walker, on losing and finding yourself in the modern city. I highly recommend it. I absolutely loved it. According to British academic Brian Jackson, the 19th century really belonged to the novelists who did sociological work in their stories. Charles Dickens fits in a second strand of writing on walking that's emerged recently. Rather than focused on the benefits that come to one's thinking and creative process through walking, this second strand is about walking as a tool, as a way of surveying others and the way that they live. In other words, this strand is about theorising the world through the everyday walking practices of others.
Early works in this tradition include Michel de Saussure, who was interested in how cities are organised by governments and corporations, and then how walkers don't walk according to the plan, how we tend to take shortcuts, and I do that quite often. He was interested in how, therefore, we're both confined by rules, but how we also exercise our agency and resist them. So if you see a pathway that's unplanned and that's been made by people cutting across the park, for example, that's called a desire line, and that's a form of resistance to the way that we're supposed to be walking. Charlotte Bates talks about this. She writes about desire lines in her contribution to walking through social research. And what she says is that in every town and city today, unofficial paths created by walkers cut across the land. An aerial view of almost any urban park is likely to reveal a crisscross of tarmac paths, pressed grass and worn earth tracks, generated by people straying designated pathways and treading other routes from place to place. Urban planners and landscape architects call these improvised routes desire lines or desire paths. They're what Ingold calls traces, enduring marks left on solid surfaces by continuous movement. These informal paths conform with as few as 15 traversals of an unpaved route. More often than not, desire lines appear beaten into grass, trampled down and worn bare by frequent footfall and the human desire to find shorter or more easily navigated routes. And then there's Irving Goffman, who was interested in how we respond to the movements of others as we walk. He uses this term civil inattention for when we pass someone on the street and we briefly make eye contact so that we signal we're not ignoring them, and then we move on. Civil inattention for Goffman is a way that we can have privacy in a crowd. It's a socially acceptable way of self-distancing. Now, in between these ideas of walking to develop thinking and walking to collect data and theorise is the work of Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher and cultural critic. He drew on French poet Charles Baudelaire his idea of the flaneur, the person, but really I think he meant men, was a man who strolls around observing society. Now, according to Charlotte Bates and Alex Rees-Taylor, and they're the editors of the book that I'm using for this lecture, there's been a renewed interest in the idea of the flaneur recently, along with a burgeoning interest in the whole idea of embodiment in the social sciences more broadly. Consequently, walking as a method has begun to happen. While there are many books on famous heroic characters who walk, there's also a shadow side of walking, which involves the tramps, the hobos, the vagrants, the dispossessed, the fugitives, the harmed and the jobless, all living life together as they padded it down the roads. An early example of this is the writing of Jim Tully, who in his autobiography Beggars of Life drew on his own experience of tramping across the American countryside for about 6 years early in the 20th century. And if you enjoy reading about how people live that sort of life, it's an amazing book, and he's an incredible writer. I really do heartily recommend it. A more recent example is Tom Hall's work. He's got a book called Footwork, where what he does is walk around the streets of London with people who are outreach workers, and they're workers whose job it is to walk and search for people who are doing it rough. And he writes, their principal task is to be available there, out on the streets, regularly and routinely enough as to make reliable and repeated contact with vulnerable adults whose lives have somehow come unstuck in the middle of the city, persons who are considered hard to reach by institutions that would offer them the various services that would cater to their multiple intersecting and complex needs, end of quote. In the conclusion to the chapter he has in the book that I'm using for the lecture today, Tom Hall and Robin Smith conclude that these outreach workers are engaged what they describe as an exploratory movement, a sort of purposeful wandering where they're alive to the possibility of discovering vulnerability, of discovering damage, of discovering need. Now, Tom Hall and Robin Smith are ethnographers, and Nathan's going to be talking about ethnography. But what they say is that they, as ethnographers, share something with the work of outreach workers in that they too are outsiders wanting to understand life from the perspective of rough sleepers. Now, sociologist Margaret Kuzenbach in 2003 coined the term the go-along, where researchers have started to walk alongside participants, much as Megan Warren did in the article we looked at last week. And as they're walking along, they're observing and experiencing a whole lot of everyday social practices that had previously been overlooked. And I quote, perhaps most importantly, the idea of talking whilst walking has enabled research interviews to be informed not just by the lives of research participants, but also by the landscapes in which they live. By sharing conversations in place and at the participants' pace, researchers are beginning to be more fully appreciative of the transient, embodied and multisensual aspects of the social. So there's more to the social, really, is what they're saying, than just talking to people and thinking about social interactions. We've also got interactions with the landscape, and one of the things that I've been interested in is how our social attitudes towards different groups of people are actually mapped on the landscape, as I said, at the University of Adelaide, where it's very obvious that the landscape is prepared more for able-bodied people than it is for people with disabilities. When it comes to the go-along and talking while walking, Margaret Kuzenbach reckons that there's 5 things that we can be thinking about and to help us explore more of this sort of research. So there's the idea of how different people perceive the same environment, and I've got an example of that coming up. How we can be doing exactly the same activities as somebody else but have different meanings for that. How people connect their life stories to specific places, and I've given you an example of that both with Mark Peel but also with Rob Watts. And then there's the idea of how people relate to others inhabiting the same space. So we're all in the same space, but how do we relate and interact with each other? And then there's the idea of how place will actually shape social interaction as well. So some places will inhibit it, some places will enhance it. Swedish sociologist Helena Holgersson has been using what she calls walk-alongs for about 10 years. She's conducted interviews with people as they walk the city of Gothenburg because of her interest in these social aspects of urban planning. So her particular interest has been the transformation of Gothenburg from an industrial to a post-industrial city. And she talks about how in 2011 she walked with and interviewed a 65-year-old Jan. Now, he moved to Gothenburg from Finland when he was a 15-year-old. So he's been there, 2011, he'd been there for about 50 years. And he talks about knocking on the door of a paint factory when he arrived in Gothenburg and immediately getting a job. Now, this really struck Helena because she knows now that Jan was part of an industrial expansion, so it was easy for him to do that, whereas Sweden has an influx now of young migrants coming from Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's not so easy for them to get jobs. What she then did was do a walk along with two young women in their early 20s, and they were involved in marketing the area of Gothenburg that Jan had lived in, which was now being gentrified or modernised or rejuvenated or regenerated. So in other words, it was being torn down and rebuilt. And what struck Helena about this walk along is that Sophia and Karen were totally disconnected from the area in which they were walking. They actually didn't know the past. They didn't know the past and the present of the place. They were just totally focused on the future of it. So unlike Jan, because they hadn't been residents there, because they didn't know the place, they didn't see what Helena calls ghosts, the sort of things that Jan had noticed, that this shop is closed, that's where I used to go with my friends, this place is open, that sort of thing. So very different. So, same place, very different meanings for different groups of people, and changes again over time. And what Andrew Clark has done is to adapt the focus group method so that he could walk and talk with young people living in an impoverished urban area that was again being rejuvenated. So he did, and that's in England. And he did 8 focus groups with 55 participants in all. Focus group members were recruited from existing youth clubs and organisations, and the smallest group he had, I think, had only 3 people, and the largest had about 12. And then there'd be a couple of researchers walking along with them. And he said that was a fantastic thing because the researchers could slip in and out and talk to this person and that person. And it felt as if the conversation was more evenly distributed amongst the participants than if they'd been sitting in a room. They audially and visually recorded all of the interviews, and what they also did was give the young people disposable cameras so that they could be taking some photo as well. And as they did the walks, what Andrew Clark says that the young people revealed was the relatively familiar places of comfort and security, as well as those to be avoided, not all the time, but certainly at particular times of the day or night, or depending on the presence or absence of other people. Participants spoke about how they engaged in the social life of the neighbourhoods, offered partial histories of what had changed and remained the same, and provided insight into the intricate geographies of belonging and not belonging that were tied to time as well as to space. They also narrated locally well-known stories about historical events, gossip and hearsay about different parts of the neighbourhood or groups within it. So the mobile focus groups began to unearth something of how young people's territoriality comes into being, not just in geographic context, but also through historical, diurnal and seasonal rhythms. This is the book that I've been using, and I've given you an idea, I guess, of walking sociology and different ideas about walking, whether we're using it to develop our thinking or whether we can use it, which is what they're suggesting, using it to do research with people or make observations of our social environment. And what I want us to do now is actually go on a walk.
So March 2020, we were banished home because of COVID, as you would know. And what I had been planning to do for week 5 was to take everyone out for a walk. And the walk that I had planned was the block between Kintore Avenue, Victoria Drive, King William Street and North Terrace. So because we couldn't do that as an activity in seminars or workshops, what I did was go into town one day in that spooky time when there was hardly anyone around, and I walked around the block. I made a recording of me walking, with some help of course, and I then made a video because I was interested in some of the sights along the way and some of the attitudes that I had to the way in which I guess colonisation is quite literally stamped on the ground, particularly in that block. This year what I've decided to do, we're free to go out and about, but I've decided to keep in that video. We can still go for a walk, and if we choose to, we can go for a walk around that block and have a look and see if there are changes, particularly since I know that there have been new pavers laid along North Terrace. And I also know that there's a new statue of the Queen in Government House that we've paid for as taxpayers. However, I'm not too sure if we can actually see it without going into the ground. So a couple of things that we can check out. But in the workshops or seminars, we can decide whereabouts we might like to go for a walk. But as we're walking, we can think about the layout of the land. And you can use this video that I've made to think about some of the things that you might like to notice along the way.
We're going to head off shortly down the Anzac Centennial Memorial Walk, past Government House, stopping at the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial, before heading to the Pioneer Woodman's Garden on King William Street and back along North Terrace to here, the National War Memorial on the corner of Kintore Avenue and North Terrace. I'm kind of curious about why I choose this particular walk, given that I'm a lifelong pacifist and Republican. Not a Republican in the Donald Trump sense, but a Republican in the let's stop having the British Queen or King as our head of state sense. Partly I chose this walk because it's convenient to the university, partly because I wanted you to think about the location of the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorials, and partly because the North Terrace section is very familiar to me. Most times when I come to work, I travel in by train, like many students and some staff, and then I walk down North Terrace. When I get to Kintore Avenue, I cross over and cut in, walking along the pathway between our various cultural institutions, the State Library, the Art Gallery, the museum, instead of along North Terrace. So let's get started. Here I am at the National War Memorial. American sociologist C. Wright Mills stresses the importance of the intersection of biography and history. He says, and I quote, "People do not usually define the troubles they endure in terms of historical change and institutional contradiction. The well-being they enjoy, they do not usually impute to the big ups and downs of the societies in which they live." Seldom aware of the intricate connection between the patterns of their own lives and the course of world history, ordinary people do not usually know what this connection means for the kinds of people they are becoming, and for the kinds of history making in which they might take part. End of quote. What Mills calls a sociological imagination is this ability to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. Part of my story is that when I was in high school, the world was in the middle of sizable challenges to the social order. There was the civil rights movement, protests against the Vietnam War, the beginnings of the women's liberation movement, and the gay rights movement. In Australia, we had a Labor government for the first time in 23 years, and Prime Minister Whitlam was an advocate for Indigenous rights and for free university education so that university could be more accessible to people from working class and middle class backgrounds. There was a lot going on, and I was influenced by it all. As a consequence of the anti-Vietnam protests and later feminist protests on Anzac Day against rape in war, and even though as a kid we'd always done something on Anzac Day, as an adult I never attended any Anzac Day dawn service. Turns out I'm not that unusual. From the 1970s, there was a nationwide waning of interest in Anzac Day. But the popularity of Anzac Day revived again from the 1990s. In a chapter by Ken English in the book Anzac Day Then and Now, numbers at dawn services began to increase from when Prime Minister Bob Hawke addressed men who'd served in World War I at Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. Numbers then gradually increased at the Anzac Cove over the years to 8,000 in 2000, then up to 17,000 before declining after warnings about possible terrorist attacks in 2005. Similarly, at services in Australia, at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, more than 20,000 people attended in the early years of the noughties. During Prime Minister John Howard's time, from 1996 to 2007, there was also a spike in teaching on Anzac themes in schools. And the centenary of Anzac, which ran from 2014 to 2018, is Australia's most significant period of national commemoration, says Veterans SA on their website. Not everyone is happy about this. Historian Marilyn Lake, for example, is against what she sees as the relentless militarisation of Australian history, and wonders why we don't honour other events like the implementation of the secret ballot or the 8-hour day. Claire Wright wonders why we don't celebrate Eureka Day. They're reasonable questions, I think. What does it tell us about Australian society that some events are commemorated with public holidays and others aren't? We have no public holiday for National Sorry Day, but we have one for a horse race, Band-Aid Cop Day. We have public holidays for the major Christian events of Easter and Christmas, but not for any other religions. In Adelaide, as you probably know, there is usually a dawn service held here each Anzac Day, as well as at other locations around the state and the country. There were almost 35,000 South Australians who enlisted to serve during World War I, which represents something like 37% of the men in the state, including Aboriginal South Australians who'd long been subject to discrimination and ill treatment, but served their country anyway. This National War Memorial was designed to commemorate those who served in World War I. Memorials don't just appear, they're the result of community debate. This memorial was first proposed in 1919 by then Premier Archibald Peake, but construction didn't begin on the memorial until 1928. Originally, the site was going to be at the entrance to Government House, but that changed in 1926. It was finally unveiled on Anzac Day in 1931, with around 75,000 people in attendance. If you go inside, there's a record room with the names of those who died in the war. It's a very sobering place to enter. Now here I am heading off down Kintore Avenue along the Anzac Memorial Walk. The Anzac Memorial Walk was approved by the South Australian Government in January 2014. It's intended to symbolically link the South Australian National War Memorial with the Torrens Parade Ground and the Pathway of Honour. Someone has collected together some beautiful photos of the Pathway of Honour, which runs at the back of Government House between Kintore Avenue and King William Street. According to Veterans SA, the Anzac Memorial Walk is, and I quote, underpinned by the theme, a memorial for all, not a few. The Anzac Centenary Memorial Walk acknowledges the impact of conflict on Australian society, both at home and abroad. The architects Grieve, Gillett and Anderson worked with representatives from the Adelaide City Council, Government House, Veterans SA and some unnamed cultural institutions. What was sought was a way to incorporate various what they call theatres of conflict. These are named in the granite pavers. I've chosen Afghanistan to show you because of the recent Four Corners expose. Anzac Memorial Walk was officially opened by the Governor of South Australia on the 23rd of April 2016. The walk meant reducing some of the land originally allocated for Government House, and it opens up a view of Government House. As I said, I'm a lifelong Republican. However, I'm pleased that our current Governor, who's been in office since 2014 and is the representative of the Queen in South Australia, is Hugh Van Lay. Hugh Van Lay came to Australia in 1977 by boat as a refugee from war-torn Vietnam. He's the first Asian Australian to be Governor in South Australia. A nice irony given Australian antipathy towards so-called boat people since the early 2000s when people from the Middle East started arriving that way. Hugh Van Lay is the 35th Governor of South Australia. Sir Douglas Nicholls was the first and only Aboriginal Australian to serve in the role of Governor of South Australia, which he did for a few months from the 1st of December 1976 to the 30th of April 1977. Dame Roma Mitchell was the first woman to serve as Governor, and she served from 1991 to 1996. Marjorie Jackson Nelson was the second woman to serve as Governor, and Marjorie served from 2001 to 2007. Out of our 35 governors then, 5.7% have been women. What does that tell us about the social order in South Australia? The Torrens Parade Ground was built in 1936 for the Army. It always had what historian Margaret Anderson calls an unofficial life. As citizens crossed through there to get to the city or the university, they made a desire line, until eventually the Adelaide City Council created a footpath up Kintore Avenue. There were also many protests against the Vietnam War held on the parade ground, and now it's the backdrop for the annual Adelaide Writers' Week. In 2001, the Torrens Parade Ground was turned over to the South Australian Government, and now it's home to various service groups, such as the South Australian branch of the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia. Near to their headquarters is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which was unveiled on the 15th of October 2006. This was the first memorial to the Vietnam War in South Australia, honouring especially the 58 men who lost their lives. The memorial was a collaboration between the RSL and a number of Vietnam Veterans Associations. It took until 2013 for a specific memorial recognising the Indigenous Australians who had served in all conflicts since the Boer War at the start of the 20th century through to the Afghanistan War. And even though they weren't considered Australian citizens until 1967 and were banned from the armed forces in the first half of the 20th century. The bronze sculpture shows a World War I male soldier and a World War II female nurse standing above a kulamon, a traditional Indigenous Australian container. The rainbow serpent surrounds the two figures. This creature is part of the Indigenous Australian creation story and the Dreamtime. A walkway of honour leads to the memorial and has the names of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander men and women who served etched in pavers. Here I am heading up towards the Women's Pioneer Garden, which comes alive during Writers' Week every March. And here's a photo of me at the 2015 Writers' Week, interviewing Tasmanian writer James Boyce about his book, Born Bad. The Women's Pioneer Garden was designed by landscape designer Elsie Cornish, with a statue created by Ola Colm and unveiled by the wife of the then Governor of South Australia, Lady Muriel Barclay Harvey. The garden was planned in 1938 as a tribute to the pioneer women of South Australia. There are 4 park benches facing the garden from the west, which are there to honour 4 women: Carol Roundtree, Elizabeth Webb-Nichols, Sybil Irving and Catherine Jean Cleave. There's a marked difference in size between the modest Women's Pioneer Garden and the Torrens Parade Ground, which for much of its life would have been a masculine domain. When it comes to different sizes, as I walk east along North Terrace in front of Government House, I'm struck by the size of the Boer War Memorial and the one of Matthew Flinders compared to that of Dame Roma Mitchell. It reminds me of going to see the statue of Catherine Helen Spence, a pioneer woman from Scotland, a novelist and the first woman candidate to stand for political office in Australia. Catherine Helen Spence was a tiny woman and the statue is life-size, but I was shocked to see how tiny it was tucked away in Light Square. When you've walked east along North Terrace, you've probably noticed the plaques with names set into the pavers. This is the Jubilee Walkway, which was opened in 1986 and formed part of the celebrations of the founding of the South Australian colony by the British in 1836. The walkway has 150 bronze plaques set into the pavement with the names of 170 people significant to the development of South Australia. The walkway begins at the South Australian African or Boer War Memorial and continues down North Terrace past the National War Memorial and past the other cultural institutions, with the plaques laid in alphabetical order. The final plaque with the Jubilee 150 board acknowledging the Adelaide City Council and Hickenbotham's homes is on North Terrace in front of the University of Adelaide's Lidgettwood building. Of the 170 names on the 150 bronze plaques, I counted 23 women, or 13.5%. There is the presence of some Aboriginal Australians, such as the Aboriginal woman Gladys Effick and David Unipon, but there aren't many. If you don't want to walk the walkway, there's an excellent Wikipedia page called Jubilee 150 Walkway, where you see the plaques and where they're located along North Terrace. You could go online and check my counting of women's names and see if I've missed other people with an Aboriginal or non-Anglo heritage. So what do I think now that I'm at the end of the walk? It bothers me still that the Aboriginal War Memorial and the Vietnam Vets War Memorial took so long to be built, and that they are so far from the cultural boulevard that is North Terrace. I'm pleased they're there though, because it does reflect changing attitudes. Layout of statues and memorials and the ongoing presence of Government House speaks to me about Australia's colonial past, about how colonisation is built into and onto the ground. I didn't see the Aboriginal flag on my walk. I didn't see the Torres Strait Islander flag either. I didn't see any information signs in Ghana, only in English. In 2002, the City of Adelaide accepted the need to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Kaurna people at the opening of their council meetings. But when it comes to the block I've just walked, I can't see that acknowledgement mapped onto the land at all.
Francis Adamson was sworn in as our new governor on the 7th of October 2021.